Morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Resolution Foundation this morning. And let me start by thanking the whole team at the Resolution Foundation who have been crunching the numbers in the budget literally all night to bring you the analysis this morning. I understand that we sold out of copies of our documents, so we will have more available upstairs for anyone who missed out at the end. Look, yesterday, one thing is clear, the Chancellor raised a lot of tax, 26 billion in that crucial year of 29-30, but pretty much everything else is up for grabs. So we will go through all of that carefully. I'm delighted to be joined by such an expert panel. Richard Hughes, Chair of the Office for Budget Responsibility. Kamal Ahmed, outgoing columnist at the Daily Telegraph, just written his last column. So I'm really pleased you're here, Kamal, to tell us what you would have said if you had a column on Sunday. And Yael Selfin, Vice Chair and Chief Economist at KPMG. So without further ado, James, tell us what you found.
All right, that was a very speedy intro. That's appreciated. Let me add my thanks to Ruth for all the hard work from the Resolution Foundation team overnight. There's a lot in this budget, so definitely read the documents that they've produced. It's very impressive set of analysis. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of the budget, focusing on basically the living standards aspects of all this. And what I wanted to do to set the scene for that is basically just remind you how difficult a task the Chancellor had yesterday. So it was set against the backdrop of not doing quite so well in the polls, shall we say, a worse economic outlook, public finances that were really struggling, pressure seemingly from all sides, a need to really build confidence. So some would say that was a difficult job. Others would say that was an impossible job. Yes, people, we have mocked up the Chancellor as your favourite action hero. So I'm gonna basically talk you through three key missions for this budget, and really set out how we think the Chancellor did against the very difficult set of cards that she was dealt. But the sort of starting point for all that is really the public finances. I've brought things down a bit at this point. But the job here was to fix the public finances. And the thing that was well trailed, that was making that a tricky task, is basically a judgment from the OBR on effectively the speed limit for the economy. So the OBR marked down its forecast for trend productivity growth. This is the key determinant of how fast the economy can grow, how more productive workers can get over time. And this chart shows you the level of that thing. And what you need to do is compare the red line which is the latest OBR forecast, to what we had back at the spring statement in green. And the thing, if you squint really hard, the key thing to see here is that the black line, which is actually the data, has come in a little bit stronger than the OBR had expected back in March, but they have marked down the growth rate thereafter. So this is not about the current data, the current performance of the government. This is about an accumulation of data where it was pretty clear that the OBR was looking optimistic in this space. So this is a big change. It takes 16 billion off revenues in that key 29-30 fiscal year for judging against the fiscal rules. But the overall forecast wasn't as bad as all this might suggest. And the key reason it wasn't as bad as many people feared, I know you all watch the Resolution Foundation very closely, so you know we weren't surprised by this, but some people were, just to get that in and make it clear that you've understood that, was that there was a big change also in the wage growth forecast. So the combination of faster wage growth, higher inflation, basically means that the OBR forecast is for a much tax-richer economy, and that really offset the effects of that lower economic speed limit. So I'll show you what all that does to the public finances. Now, I know this audience loves a complicated fiscal chart, so I keep delivering these, but this is really key for what's going on in terms of this overall forecast. So if you look at the light sort of pinky bars that are above the line, so everything above the line here is higher borrowing, making the Chancellor's life harder. Those light pinky bars are what's coming through from that economy forecast. And you could see that by the end of the forecast, it was just $5.5 billion worse on that sort of key economy-driven bit of the forecast. But that's not the only thing going on, as you can see in all this. The sort of dark red bars here, those are the effects of the U-turns the government's announced, primarily on winter fuel payments, on reforming disability benefits since the spring statement. And $5 billion of extra giveaways by the end of the by the 29-30 point here. So I'll talk a little bit more about this, but you could see deterioration in the forecast, but also policy coming through in here as well. And that was met with a huge backloaded rise in taxes. So you can see that 26 billion number Ruth mentioned in 29-30. That's really showing you what the government is doing to repair the public finances, with 3/4 of that adjustment coming after the date of a likely election. So the fiscal repair job is very backloaded here, and you can see at the start of the forecast, borrowing is actually higher in all this, despite all the sort of doom and gloom about how much tightening and how much higher taxes we were going to get here. The other key thing on the fiscal repair job here is what's happening to the Chancellor's buffers against her fiscal rules. So this chart just shows you the buffer against the commitment to bring day-to-day spending into line with tax receipts in the fourth year of the forecast. Note that this the horizon for this has moved forward one, which makes this now a higher bar for the Chancellor. But you can see, if we compare where the Chancellor has got to with a more than doubling of the headroom against that fiscal rule, so that's overachieved relative to market expectations. This will build confidence in the public finances. But if we look at that in a historical context, you can see the sort of current surplus that the Chancellor is planning to run is smaller than we've typically seen since the financial crisis. So if you ignore that financial crisis period, you can see we've tended to at least forecast that there would be a current surplus, even if that hasn't actually been achieved at any point during this period. It's definitely worth keeping that in mind. So public finances definitely improve, but there's still worries here with the backloaded nature of that adjustment, higher borrowing in the near term, and all this relies on the Chancellor being able to deliver a big tightening around the time of the next election. So certainly not out of the woods yet. I can't tell you, by the way, how long it took me to get this font sorted out, so I hope you're admiring it. So this is a 2 a.m. job. But the second key mission for the Chancellor here was to really improve the tax system, really put the tax system on an improving path. And we got some genuinely big tax rises again in this budget. So having said she wouldn't be back for more, we had this 26 billion rise in taxes. That's 68 billion on a scorecard basis across 2 budgets. So that's the biggest double whammy, as we're calling it, of taxes for a newly elected government on record. The only thing that's comparable is the sort of 93 experience, and indeed that's definitely lower. And this takes the tax take as a whole relative to the size of the economy up to a new all-time high. So big decision here in this budget, really to tax more. So what's actually been happening on the tax side? Well, the biggest bit that of the tax adjustment was 3 more years of threshold freezes, raising about 12 to 13 billion by the end of the forecast period. And we've now had 9 years of this stealth tax increases across thresholds, and basically if you're a typical worker on about £35,000, that's increasing your taxes by about £1,400 by the end of the decade here. So this is a really big change. It seems to be one that people are more readily able to accept, and it's one that chancellors have relied on. A point we've made is that we prefer increases in the rate of income tax. You see, that's partly because threshold freezes really let off the top of the distribution, given the withdrawal of the personal tax allowance. And you could see in this chart, if you look at the lines, that basically more or less everybody would have been better off if we increased the rates rather than carried on with that freeze. So manifesto busting, but avoiding that manifesto busting increase has really cost many of us. So continued threshold freezes. There were quite a large number. Some people have used the word smorgasbord. I try not to perpetuate that particular metaphor, but there was quite a few reforms on the tax side. But the one I'm highlighting here is the mansion tax. That's a pretty small tax. It's about £500 million. But the key thing is this is a step in the right direction, if you like, on property taxation. So you can see here the average rates of tax are still very regressive in this tax system, but we're seeing a chink of light here in a way that taxes on property can be reformed from here. The other big bit of reform that we got was on motoring taxes. So introducing taxes on EVs, very low level to start with, and actually figuring out a way to gradually at least raise fuel duty. Those were really important steps here as well. What we're lacking though at this point is really a roadmap for what this government wants the tax system to look like. So we got a little bit of moves to help equalise taxes on different types of incomes. So we got 2p increase in landlords' income, shareholder savers. So there was some positive moves there. But this chart, and I would focus on the top line here, which really zeroes in on a tax distortion that we have been very focused on here at the Resolution Foundation, the difference between taxation for self-employed people and those working as employees. That's at a record high, and basically this budget doesn't touch that, leaves it at that high level. But overall, there was tax reforms to like here but what we'd like to see really is a tax plan from this government. All right, final step, final mission. The Chancellor really needed to address the high cost of living, particularly reducing the extent to which the government is putting extra pressure on families with the high cost of living. And one place we saw action yesterday from the Chancellor was on energy bills, bringing some of the policy costs, taking some of the policy costs out of particularly electricity, and that's a very progressive policy in itself. So if you look at the line on this chart showing you the amount of the sort of extent to which this boosts household income across the distribution, but a key thing here is that energy costs are very widely distributed even within income bands. So you can have quite low income households with very high energy use, and helping those households is something that the Chancellor has managed with all this. So if you tot up all the various bits of support, so if you look at the energy bill support, what's going on with fuel duty, what's going on with rail fares. A typical family gains about £230 in this budget, so not huge, but definitely welcome in the context of the high cost of living. The other thing this cost of living support does is really help bring down inflation. So the OBR said the peak impact of measures was about 0.5 percentage point in the second quarter of next year. That will help with the Bank of England bringing down interest rates in the medium term as well, which is something the government has struggled to assist with, playing that joint role with the Bank of England. So cost of living support on energy, but also importantly, really welcome support in terms of scrapping the 2-child limit. So I think this is peak complexity for me. So there's a lot going on in this chart. I'll just pick out a couple of things for you. What this is doing is totting up all Rachel Reeves' policies across since the election, really looking at tax and benefit effects across this parliament as a whole. And if you look at the 2-child limit, those light blue bars that are boosting income at the bottom there, you can see that basically that really helps poorer families, 3 in 5 of which are in work, so that you don't often hear that stat. But what you've got here is more than 500,000 families gaining an average of around £5,300, so by 29-30. So a really big support measure, simply the most cost-effective way to bring down child poverty, which is something the government says that it wants to do and something we think is extremely important here at the Resolution Foundation. And if you combine those benefit measures with the tax measures, so you can see in dark blue the really big employer NI changes and the effect in green of the threshold freezes, you can see that this is a very progressive set of policies now when you put all this together. So the poorest half of families have gained about £90 on average. So if you look at the white dots in this chart, compared to losses of around £1,000 for the top half. So quite a different set of outcomes across that income distribution. All right, heading for the exit here. So final chart, just reminding you that the outlook for living standards remains a difficult one despite that progressive support. With, if you look at the end of this chart, the current Parliament forecast to have average real household disposable income growth of just 0.5%. So very weak, stronger than the previous Parliament. That was the weakest on record. It's consistent with the government hitting its target of improving living standards, but still a very weak outlook. All right, that's my summary, just in terms of where we got to on those 3 impossible missions, and I'm going to tell you that there was mixed evidence on each of them, so this is not very Tom Cruise, this is a little bit more economist at this point. But on the fixing the public finances, the increase in headroom, very welcome. Borrowing, but that backloaded nature really increases the risks, and we've seen higher borrowing in the near term. Good, generally welcome measures on taxes, although the threshold freezers led off those very high earners, but we'd like to see reform from here. And on easing the cost of living squeeze, welcome energy support, welcome particularly the scrapping of the 2-child limit, but still a very difficult outlook. And that's it from me.
Thank you, James. Lots to chew over. So, Richard, let's come to you, and let's start with the elements so that we can spend the rest of the time on the forecast. I've worked in a previous role very closely with the OBR team, and I know how hard they and you have worked over the last few months, and they will be as frustrated as everyone else to make the news in the wrong way yesterday. But tell us what happened.
Thank you, Ruth, and thank you for this opportunity. A link to our EFO document was inadvertently made accessible to the public prior to the conclusion of the Chancellor's statement when it is usually published. It wasn't published on our website, but there was a link that somebody managed to find, and that made it accessible, and then it was then disseminated. As soon as it was discovered, we took action to take it down. Today I've written to the Chancellor and the Chair of the Treasury Select Committee to apologise and take full responsibility for what has happened. I've initiated an investigation, which will be overseen by the Oversight Board of the OBR. It will report to the Treasury and the Treasury Select Committee, to whom we are jointly accountable, with input from Professor Kieran Martin, who is the former head of the National Cyber Security Council. We will look into how this happened. It will identify actions required to ensure it doesn't happen again. We'll implement those recommendations in full. I'm personally mortified by what happened. We take budget security incredibly seriously, which is why this investigation is already underway, and will report very swiftly by early next week. Personally, I serve day to day subject to the confidence of the Chancellor and the Treasury Committee. If they both conclude in light of that investigation they no longer have confidence in me, then of course I will resign, which is what you do when you're the chair of something called the Office for Budget Responsibility.
But look, Richard, yesterday you published an extremely important forecast, some really, really important judgments on the economy, which tell us about the future of this country and what's happened to our productivity over many years. So why don't you tell us about that forecast?
Yes, and as with all economy forecasts and fiscal forecasts, there are a lot of moving parts, and understanding all the components of that are really important to getting the big picture. One of the biggest changes we made in this forecast was we downgraded our assumption for productivity growth over the medium term, as James is showing in his first slide. That was reflecting a judgment that we'd been assuming a relatively strong rebound in productivity in the wake of the pandemic and then the energy crisis. We thought a significant portion of the sluggishness of UK productivity growth coming out of those shocks was due to those crises, and that as those shocks dissipated, productivity would recover. It clearly hasn't in recent data. And so with the passage of time, that was one reason to downgrade. Another was global, which is that there are some new global headwinds in the global economy since our forecast in March. US tariffs going up, and also just wider global trade restrictions being put in place, which is why trade wars are very bad things for everybody, especially an open economy like the UK, which relies a lot on trade as a driver for growth. So, and for the first time that I've seen in my career, the IMF is actually forecasting over the next 5 years trade falling as a share of GDP. We have all lived in a world where the global economy was integrating, and that has been a huge driver of productivity growth around the world, including here in the UK. If global integration goes into reverse, then productivity is going to go into reverse, not just in this country, but in a lot of other places. And so that was another factor that fed into our calculation that it was time to do a downgrade. Why did I mention moving parts? Because that was only one of the moving parts in our economy forecast, which was relevant to the fiscal outlook. In isolation, the downgrade in productivity by 0.3% would have knocked £15 billion roughly off tax receipts by the end of the decade. But there were two offsetting effects in our forecast. One was we've got some higher inflation, which we've all seen in the numbers, and we're projecting will stay higher for longer in this forecast. And because taxes are collected, on nominal things, not real things, it's volumes times prices that matters what you collect in things like VAT. As well as, in particular, income tax and national insurance when personal tax thresholds are frozen. So just that inflation effect was worth an offsetting £15 billion, more or less negating the impact from productivity. And on top of that, we've also seen stronger earnings and wage growth. And what that does is further push people up into higher tax bands, especially in the context of frozen thresholds. And it's important to bear in mind that the effective tax rate on labour income on workers is twice the effective tax rate on corporations. And one of the things which we've done in our forecast is rebalance some of the growth more toward labour incomes and consumption, less toward corporate profits and investment. And those just things are a lot more tax rich when they're growing faster than you previously thought. And that gave a further £10 billion boost to receipts. And then there's about £6 billion more from other bits and pieces. And in net terms, despite the productivity downgrade, receipts are actually up by £16 billion in our forecast. And so sometimes your own forecasts surprise you, and they surprised us in this case. Why did the Chancellor still have a fiscal hole to fill? Well, it was because spending was also up, and quite significantly as well, across a range of different spending heads. Welfare was up by quite a lot from benefit caseloads and also inflation. Departmental spending was pressures on departmental spending are building, and we reduced some of our underspend assumptions against departmental budgets because we think it's going to be hard for the Treasury to hold departments to those over the spending review period, despite the fact that they were agreed just back in June. And then the really big surprise is just how much local authority spending and borrowing has come in much higher than we thought. Sort of, double-digit upward revisions to local authority borrowing. Local authorities are under enormous pressure these days, in particular from the special education needs program, which at the moment they are being forced to fund. They're allowed to set aside the deficits for accounting purposes, and that set aside was extended for a few more years into the forecast, and that's allowed them to borrow more to meet these pressures. But they've also got other pressures on things like housing due to the need for repairs and other things. So local authorities, for the first time, became suddenly a big source of risk and pressure in our forecast, which they haven't been for a long time, which added further to the spending pressures, which added up to £22 billion in our pre-measures forecast. And that's what left the Chancellor £6 billion down on her £10 billion headroom. And then all the work that you saw James talk about that she did in the budget was trying to get that headroom back to where it was, and then a bit, and then further up to get it from £10 billion up to the £22 billion she had in the post-measures forecast, and that was done basically by raising taxes by a lot more than she raised spending.
That's such a helpful explanation, Richard. And I guess in the end, after all of the run into this budget, the economy basically meant not very much for the fiscal forecast, and all of the move in your forecast, that 6 billion deterioration, came from these kind of fiscal oddities that you get in a forecast and that we need experts like you to tell us about, like local government borrowing. Kamal, what did you make of this budget?
Well, it was an archly political budget. She had 3 audiences, didn't she, Rachel Reeves? I thought actually her performance in the House of Commons was a good one. She had a narrative and a story which she was trying to tell the country. And her 3 audiences started with the Labour Party. And I think both Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves are rather surprised that a year after a big but shallow majority, they're in a position where they're having to reassure their own backbenchers that they've got any chance at the next election. But we are where we are, and they have made a decision, obviously the 2 of them. And this was first signalled with the U-turn on the winter fuel allowances, that they were going to abandon the offer they had made to the electorate before the election. If you go back to an interview that Keir Starmer did in The Economist in 2023, when he said, Labour's instinct is always to lean towards taxes first. We will not do that. They've abandoned that position, which is what they offered the voters in 2024, and they've moved towards a traditional tax and spend, what is often described as a soft left position. And this was the absolute marker of that. You said second album syndrome. I think this is actually their first album of a very different government. And I think for the Labour Parliamentary Party and the party, it was very necessary, because the Prime Minister and the Chancellor were in a politically precarious position, which may not last beyond the elections of next May. So what we have now, at least for the public, is a very definite sense of how this government is going to approach the political and economic challenges it faces domestically, and that tax and spend will be the approach. Those of us who have covered budgets for many, many years know that Labour is always in a battle within itself between what might be described as traditionally the sort of Blairite right side of the Labour Party, which is much more insistent on thinking about where the median voter is, and then what's described as the soft left of Labour, which is much more where is the median Labour member. And this was a budget for the median Labour member. Things like, much welcomed, as you said, the lifting of the 2-child cap on benefits is something which plays into that tussle within Labour. So for the Labour Party and the parliamentary MPs, it was a good performance. Rachel will be pleased with how it landed with those colleagues. Now, for the markets, for the moment, it's going to be steady as she goes. Rachel Reeves has been very nervous about the debt markets and their reflections on the UK's position in borrowing. And what she has done here with the doubling of the headroom, she's given some reassurance, and I think that's probably temporary reassurance, that this government is serious about how it borrows money. And as we said, they've left an awful lot to do in the second half of the forecast. So for the market, she will also be pleased. I think her biggest risk is for the third audience, which is the voter, and the audience that actually is most important. Because when you look at issues like trust and how do voters think about their governments, that has been one of the most fundamental changes over my career covering politics and economics, has been the diminution of trust in institutions to be able to A, run things, and B, do the things they said they were going to do. And I think Rachel Reeves has raised the risk through this budget that the public will simply switch away from what this government is trying to offer them. And the big danger is that even though real wages may rise, even though people's personal optimism may grow, the connection between that and what the government does is breaking or has already broken. And I think that is the biggest political risk for her. And then as the final point, Labour, when it goes into this soft left crouch around servicing their supporters rather than serving the country, leans into complexity. This budget, I think, had 88 policy measures in it, and different ways of taxing, different ways of approaching economic growth. None of the supposed pro-growth measures that Rachel Reeves announced were seen as material by the OBR, which I think suggests that the growth trajectory for this country is still under a huge amount of pressure. But I also worry intensely that Labour always overcomplicates, becomes too micro, is worried about bus fares in cities and small road links in rural areas than it is about the macro message of releasing some of the animal spirits, supporting business and wealth creation, and without much more of a narrative about what kind of country we want to be. And Peter Mandelson has a lot of faults, but when he said Labour is intensely relaxed about people being filthy rich as long as they pay their taxes, he spoke to something very significant about Labour, which they have lost here, which is that they are pro-growth and pro-wealth creation and pro-entrepreneurialism. And with that gone, although the forecast has got slightly more positive on the economy, I think that the overall response to this from the wealth creating part of the economy, which is the part that she says is the priority for her, is going to be much more difficult to prosecute. And this very complicated way of operating in budgets, I think, becomes more and more of a risk for getting the growth that she claims she wants.
Really interesting, Kamal, thank you. And I'm glad you mentioned number of measures. We've been thinking about how you might measure the smorgasbordness of a budget. The other one we thought about was, how much of your revenue do you raise from your biggest measures? And we reckon on that sort of measure, this is the 13th most smorgasbordy budget in the last 30 or so years. So quite far up there, but not quite at the top. Can I just come back to you on tax and spend before I come to Yale? So a lot of the headlines this morning are characterising this budget as a tax and spend budget. But when I look at the numbers, what the Chancellor's done is she put up taxes by 26 billion, as we talked about. She increased headroom by 12 billion. Her forecast got worse by 6. So it's a tax by 26, spend 8 budget, isn't it? Isn't it really a tax and save budget?
But that would, she has not said anywhere in this budget that where she wants to get to on things like welfare spending, on the huge increases in the spending needs of the country. I think one of the most significant discussions this country needs to have is what does the state do? Your point, Richard, about local authority finances are broken. I mean, if you look at the report by the Institute for Government 3 or 4 weeks ago, and it's well worth digging that out. The way that local government was created through COVID, by the extra pressures around adult care, statutory rights that, or statutory responsibilities that local government has. We need to have a discussion about what is the state there to do and how much of it are we willing to pay for. I would say that you should be putting the economy and the ability of private industry and the private sector to build growth, and then that will flow through. But what the government has done, obviously, being a Labour government, they've put the spending ahead of that, the way that they operate and do that ahead of actually getting growth to happen. So if you obviously what you say, Ruth, is correct, but the public will hear taxes up, benefits up. And that's what we mean when we say tax and spend.
Well, they'll hear because that's what
Yes.
we're saying. But I mean, she increased welfare spending by 3 billion. She put taxes up by 26. The rest is underlying in the forecast. Yeah, let me come to you. What were you hoping for in this budget? What did you get?
So I see this budget as a missed opportunity generally. I think first budget, fine, you're settling in. Second budget, this is really an opportunity to do something, especially with the majority she has. First thing for me is tax and tax reforms. We should really try and simplify the tax system and work through the distortions there so that we have better incentives for work and for growing businesses and for moving homes. There's so much that can be done, and it's tax neutral essentially, but it will help growth more generally. So that was my first hope that I think is probably gone now. And then on productivity, I wanted to touch a little bit on productivity because I think that is really important. It's important to the Chancellor, but it's also very important to us. We're generally a little bit more pessimistic than the OBR in terms of our forecast, but it's very difficult to forecast this, so it's all fine. We have a slightly lower projection for longer term growth, but we could be wrong, OBR could be right. But I think, especially when you look at AI, which seems to be really important right now, we're again a little bit more pessimistic on how much that will drive growth in the medium term. And I think this is really important to understand where you will need support, you will need government support to help businesses embed AI. I think it's quite possible that quite a lot of what we're hearing about layoffs that are driven by AI, they're not really driven by AI, it's a bit more aspirational. It will take probably a decade to embed AI and new technologies in businesses and providing some support for people to retrain as well as for businesses to try and experiment and encourage is really important. I didn't see anything there. For that, we need to drive policy much more towards a much more flexible labour market and supporting that embracement of new technologies. And then ultimately, a big chunk of that increase in productivity will need to come from the public sector, where embedding new technology and usage of data is much harder to do. And I think one of the things that I find really despairing is that all this rhetoric against external advisors and which is going to make it much harder to do, and also make any efforts to try and reform things harder. So it just makes me feel very disappointed by the whole dynamics there, not just because it's going to cost us more money, but also it's a question of saving lives. Yeah, getting our public sector more productive. It is really, really important. And I do not see any drive there or any inspiration to get things on the right path. So that is another disappointment for me. And then ultimately, when we look at growth will be, as the Chancellor says, and she's absolutely right, driven by business investment to a large degree. We've seen relatively strong business investment recently, but that's been driven by two sectors. yeah, the majority of business investment is very weak, if not falling. And in order to get business inspired to invest in the UK, you need to think, what have they thought about this budget? Number one, taxes are likely to come back up, because there's probably, you will need to go back to the public in a couple of years' time, or maybe a little bit later. And they're probably likely to be the next one in terms of where it's going to hit. So that's not increasing confidence. And then when you think about a message, and we talked about that message earlier, there is no message. So it's very difficult for businesses to think there is growth. So if you're going to be taxed more and there's no growth, why would you invest in the UK? There's just really no compelling argument from this budget to get business investment going.
Okay, not very cheery, but really, really interesting. Let's pick up on a question online that comes to some of Yale's points, and I might ask some others, and then let's come to any questions in the room. So I think, Yale, you've sort of given us your answer to this question, interested in whether you think, what measures might have made a difference. And Richard, you looked at these measures as part of your forecast and came to the view that none of them met your threshold, but this threshold is an interesting kind of new feature of your framework. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so we've, for the last 3 years, we've taken a more transparent approach to scoring the supply side effects of government policy, so those that we think could boost growth potential output in the medium to long term. Up until now, we've always had a significance criteria, but never quite defined what significance means. That has led to a very large volume of policies that we've had to assess, some of which had very small effects on things like employment, down to the sort of tens of thousands. And so we felt it was important to really focus on those measures that would make a material difference to our forecast. So we've now established that materiality threshold at 0.1% of potential output in 5 years' time. Strictly speaking, that's enough to actually show up in one of our tables, because we only round GDP to the nearest tenth of a percentage point. And we also think that that's a reasonable materiality threshold for thinking about what's a meaningful growth measure that we want to make sure we can account for and track over time. Previous budgets from this government and the previous government have exceeded that threshold, both in the positive direction and in the negative direction. Planning reform was a positive example. The increase in NICs was a negative example. In this budget, there were no policies that met that threshold, either on the positive side or on the negative side.
And isn't it slightly surprising in a way that a budget that raises 26 billion of tax doesn't have a negative effect on growth?
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was. We're not saying it has no effect, but it was one that wasn't material according to our materiality threshold. Certainly, raising taxes on people has an effect on their work incentives and overall employment.
Any further comments either of you wanted to make on growth?
I just think on this there is this sort of mood issue, which I think is hard to define and obviously difficult to sort of put in data. But if you think that if Rachel Reeves's mission is growth, then everything she does should be framed by that. And to go back to what I was saying, which is why this was a very political budget, that wasn't what she did. She didn't get up to speak to businesses and say, this is how we're going to do it, and I'm going to work with you, or however she had framed it, it would have been a very different budget. Rachel Reeves imagined this budget would be very different from the one she has given. She claims it's external forces, but actually the poison pills were scattered over the last year from the last budget onwards, and the U-turns that the Resolution Foundation has scored. And growth is data and obviously what she actually does practically, but it is also mood. And I think that's where Labour always struggled, the sense of the mood of the nation and planning out a vision for the country. And I think this is doing the opposite. It will be interesting, Richard, I think, to look at how the tax increases start affecting people. I think raising tax thresholds is one of the most sort of negative ways of raising taxes that the public don't really see, but they do obviously ultimately notice. And I think that the tone of the way, of course, this budget has been covered will have an effect on consumer confidence, because they imagine that things will be coming towards them, i.e. I'm going to be paying more tax, but they won't really be able to see it. The clarity of a rate rise would have been a much better way of trying to raise the taxes that she has raised.
I mean, look, just on that budget speculation, so the Chancellor has put a lot of store by cutting the chaos, bringing down uncertainty, and that being a way of delivering growth. But this has been a really exceptional budget in terms of the amount of information that has come out of the Treasury, the new industrial level of expectations management that we're becoming more and more used to. But when you're seeing pre-budget U-turns playing out in the press and in very deliberate speeches, this is having a palpable effect. When the Bank of England, when the Governor of the Bank of England is saying there is evidence that budget uncertainty is hitting the economy, then you know that this is not helping in terms of. So I think one major lesson from the past few months, which frankly feels like the longest budget run-in that I've ever experienced. We've been at fever pitch. If you've been following every bit of to and froing on all this for what feels like 4 months, but so there's definitely a process point here. We could do this better. We can make this a less uncertainty creating event, and that's something that the Chancellor should definitely do going forward.
Great. Look, conscious of time, let's make sure people in the room have a chance to ask any questions. Lots over there, Rob.
So thank you, David Robinson, Market News. Just on the productivity revision, I do wonder, after this episode, does it make people rethink the idea that a productivity estimate should really be driven by one dominant, however clever, economist at the OBR? Because the revisions have tended to reflect the views of an individual.
Great, thanks. Can we pass the microphone to Dan?
Thank you. Slightly similar. James Richardson from the Climate Change Committee. I wanted to ask how much of the productivity downgrade is really about a sequence of shocks, most recently from fossil fuels, rather than a kind of trend, as an economist might think about it. And should we try and bring more of the analysis from the fiscal risks report into that central estimate of growth?
Richard, do you want to take that second one first, and maybe I can throw at you as well this kind of how much this budget has addressed long-term fiscal, with the link being this paper mile on electric vehicles?
Yeah, it's a mixture of shocks and trends. So clearly there have been a set of shocks to the UK economy. The financial crisis affected everybody, hit us particularly hard. Brexit hit us particularly hard because we were the only country that did it. And so for those reasons, all those things have had an effect on our long run potential output alongside. But what we also looked at in the paper, and maybe one of the most instructive things to look at, was the sectoral composition of productivity, pre-financial crisis and post-financial crisis. And what you saw pre-financial crisis was there was a set of sectors that were really the engines of productivity growth in the UK. It was financial services, ICT, and manufacturing. And then every other sector was kind of just bumping along. Post-financial crisis, all three of those sectors' growth went back to the average of the rest of the UK economy, but nothing else has really come to the fore to replace them. We do think that AI has the potential to provide some of that engine of productivity growth over the medium term, but it's going to take some time. Its effect only builds up to 0.2% of the 1% that we're assuming productivity gets back to from its current level of 0.5. So we do think that AI offers the possibility of being a driver of growth going forward. But what you didn't see is the sort of happy combination pre-financial crisis of a booming financial sector, a booming ICT sector, and booming manufacturing all at the same time. And what you also know when you look at the composition of UK GDP is that we've got an aging society. We're going to be spending more and more of our money and have more and more employment in health and social care. And we also know that the productivity growth in the health and social care sector has been extraordinarily low for a significant period of time.
Richard, could I just ask if that's right, that it's one pointy-headed economist who sort of says, right, we think this is the number?
It's not right. There are three of us on the Budget Responsibility Committee, and we're appointed at different times. We come to consensus on these kind of issues, and we also talk a lot to other economists about what their views on these kind of questions are. We benchmark ourselves against other forecasts and note where we differ. So it's not just one pointy-headed economist; it's all three of us. And we take a look at what the rest of the economic community, including people like Yale, say on these kind of issues, and take a judgment around.
Can I just add something on policy that I think is really important, because we have seen productivity stronger in the US, so we know it is possible. But one of the things that is different there is that they invent more of that technology, and the studies that show that you get stronger productivity in countries where the technology is actually invented, because it's much easier to embed it. So one of the things that we really need to try and strive, and that's one of the things that we would really want the Chancellor to aim at, is encourage much more of that technology being invented here. It is really, really important. The multiplier effects are so strong.
And not just invented Yale, but diffused as well.
It will be easier to diffuse. Yeah. So if it's invented here, more invented here, easier to diffuse here as well.
Is three-pointed-headed economists enough, Kamal?
We've really struggled, haven't we, to judge productivity. I think, Richard, your explanation of the effects of the financial crash are absolutely fascinating. I think the other thing that we've really struggled to understand is the monopsony effects of huge tech platforms and how they have operated in a way globally that has affected the productivity nationally. And I think it's very hard to judge how something like an Amazon or Meta or Google has affected the way that economies operate. It's not building stuff in a factory in Walsall. And I think AI is going to be equally difficult to make judgments on, given the effects it will have. Anyone who has sat through, as I did, Elon Musk's shareholder presentation at the beginning of November, when he was awarded his $1 trillion pay package, would be astonished at the completely different conversation that is being had around robotics, around autonomous vehicles, around AI intelligence, than the conversation we're having here about the moving of this tax rate and that tax rate. And I think that governments, given their size and their ability and their strength in conversations, needs to be much more leaning into those types of issues than it is around this really micro discussion we're having about 88 policy announcements in one moment in the government. I think that this needs to be a bigger and grander conversation about where this country is going. And Yale, to your point about, I started my own business 4.5 years ago in the UK and in America. And in New York, the attitudinal difference to starting your own business in London, it's a media business called The News Movement, was remarkable. I mean, remarkable. The entrepreneurial spirit, the go and get it, go and do it, the ability to raise funding, were all very, very different there than they were here.
Mm. And we really need to look forward. We need to understand technology is way ahead of us, and we need to be much more prepared for it. And I don't see any of that in the budget.
There was one interesting thing, sorry, we just wanted to, Rachel Reeves said this was going to be all about optimism this year. And that is exactly the opposite to what...
Are you not feeling it at this point?
Anyway, sorry.
Let's take some more questions. I think, Joe at the front.
John Hills from ITV News. I wanted to sort of pick up on the issue of public trust that Kamal mentioned is fraying, because that's reflected in the polls. I mean, the Chancellor's personal poll ratings are dire. I wondered to what degree the system, you think that the system could be improved, because public trust in government, in institutions like the OBR, is really, really important. So I think we can probably agree on that. But to what degree can changes be made that might improve or restore public trust? Because, I mean, it depends how you were talking about the poison pill, Kamal. The original villain in this is Jeremy Hunt, isn't it? That he makes a load of tax cuts that look completely unaffordable, even at the time, leaves this government with spending budgets which look completely undeliverable and an overhang on a OBR forecast that looks a bit on the optimistic side. Rachel Reeves indulges in the fiscal fiction, and what the public get is ultimately a party that in opposition promises £8 billion of tax rises, and then in government within 16 months delivers £68 billion of the tax rises. I mean, is it any wonder that people feel disillusioned? And in terms of also the speculation running up to the budget, which has been wearisome even for a journalist, and it's on my patch, I wonder, Richard, specifically whether it's worth rethinking the OBR's publication of the timeline, the ping and the ponging between Treasury and because it's been, is there a different way of managing and organising that? So perhaps the answer isn't so much leaks and speculation.
Okay, I don't know if that was one question, so let's come back on that. James, on improving the system, you've already mentioned one thing around the kind of level of public speculation ahead of this event. There's also, as Joel said, this issue of how we have a more honest conversation about tax and spending, and no politician is really facing up to that. Would you change anything about the system to fix that?
Yeah, I mean, the to the point about fiscal fictions, I do think what we've got now is a little bit different to what we had under Jeremy Hunt, where there were just these sort of spending cuts penciled in off in the never never. There is an element of that. There's a tussle you can see between the OBR and the Treasury forecast about what's going on with spending. The Treasury say they're cutting spending. The OBR say it doesn't look like you're going to be able to do that. But to the extent that the Treasury say they are cutting spending, we know that the Chancellor is committed to a spending review in a couple of years' time. So we'll get the details of that, and it's a different sort of situation. But on taxes, there is this very backloaded bit to all this, and I suppose the combination of a hint of unallocated spending cuts plus backloaded tax cuts that are sort of pushed a bit towards the election look maybe a bit implausible. It sort of suggests that the improving, the reforming of the tax system may be done for this Parliament. I think that would be a real shame. The hints of the improved motoring taxes, the taxes on where the nettle is being grasped on the property side, we should see more of that, not less. We need a plan for the tax system that is credible, that shows where the government is going on the tax side.
And just on trust, how much is this issue around uncertainty and business confidence that you mentioned, partly that there isn't a belief that what's in this budget will be delivered?
Well, I mean, we've already touched on the fact that the budget wasn't really for business. Businesses don't have the time to read so many pages and all these small things. They want a clear message that is backed up and delivered by action. So it wasn't really for business. It's not business friendly. And therefore, it's very difficult to be credible as such.
But she could have raised £26 billion from businesses. Is there not?
Well, she already did it last time, so it would have been difficult to go back. But I think businesses have no illusions that more will be potentially coming when that credibility of cuts to day-to-day spending is being more timely, if you like. It has to be confronted. So I think in terms of the mood, there's disappointment. I think the Labour Party prior to the election was the engaging party with businesses and were saying a lot of the right things. The Chancellor still says a lot of the right things. It's just that there's no delivery, and I think the time has passed when you actually hope this will come. So I think there's a risk here that now it will be very difficult to gain the trust of business again.
Now, Richard, you made pretty clear in your forward that the forecast didn't change very, very much, that you did, as usual, kind of refine your judgments through the process, but that big judgment on productivity and wages was was made quite early on, and that's a bit different from the narrative one got if one just read the papers. But there was a specific question for you about whether this publication of the timetable has fueled the speculation further.
I suppose my general thoughts on public trust in institutions is that I think it's a challenge for all public institutions to build and maintain public trust. Our approach to trying to build and maintain public trust is maximum transparency, both about in the EFO itself, which is why it keeps getting longer and longer, and then there's an attempt to make it shorter, and then it gets longer and longer again because people keep asking us questions and want more information, and we try to provide it. And so I do think being responsive to people's requests for information and understanding and transparency is important to trust. I think the other thing is admitting mistakes, which we do every year about our forecast. When we do a thing called the forecast evaluation report, you admit fallibility, and you say, when we get our forecast wrong, here's how wrong they were, here's why, and here's how you try and improve it. And also the way I tried to do at the start of this, which is admit we make mistakes around the process. On the timetable, I mean, that was a recommendation of a review after it was done by our oversight board to give more transparency around the process and interactions between us and the Treasury. We've always written it up in the forward to the Treasury document, including things like when we take market windows. And so we try to make the process itself transparent, because I think you can't just be transparent about the outcome, you have to be transparent about how you got there.
Richard, could I ask you what affects you still having two forecasts, which obviously has been in the legislation for many decades, but the government only having one fiscal event? How does that affect next spring when you're going to come out with a forecast and Rachel Reeves will be doing what, do we imagine?
I mean, it's the arrangement that's in place in most advanced economies these days, especially in European economies, because they have this thing called the European semester, where they all have to produce sort of draft fiscal plans in the spring, and because most of them are part of the single currency, they have to discuss them and make sure they're consistent with their obligations under European treaties. It's also the way fiscal policy works in Australia and other Commonwealth countries as well. And what it means is that the spring forecast is more of a kind of waypoint on the way to the budget. It's more of a health check. And the government doesn't feel obliged to respond to it, but it basically sort of lays the groundwork for the work they do to then prepare for the budget in the autumn. The fact that Chancellor's left herself more headroom also means that her headroom now exceeds the average forecast to forecast variation in our forecast for borrowing 4 years out, which also means that there's a better chance that the rules will be met in a given forecast in the future.
Have you thought about how you'll forecast without evaluating the fiscal rules?
It'll have implications for what's called Chapter 7, which I'm sure you know very well, but at the moment it's titled Performance Against the Fiscal Targets, which we will need to rethink because we will not be assessing performance against the fiscal targets. We will still be producing forecasts of the fiscal aggregates that are included in the fiscal targets, because we did before they were fiscal targets, and we will continue to do so afterwards. But quite how we focus our analysis of fiscal policy will need to change, given that the government is not trying to meet those fiscal targets in the spring forecast.
It's a growth industry for think tanks, I suppose. That's it. Good.
Should we take a couple more questions at the front, and then maybe you can sneak another few in? Rob.
Francis Coppola. My question's actually aimed at James, because this is the subject of my question is kind of very much a Resolution Foundation thing. I want to ask about the rise in the national living wage. I'm old enough to remember when wage differentials was a term that was bandied around. And I have been seeing in some stuff that I'm involved in, some discussion again about wage differentials, about the erosion of wage differentials for people at slightly higher income levels. What do you think the impact's going to be on wage demands, on incentives to work, and on productivity?
Okay, national minimum wage question, which we like. Rob, did you want to take one over there? Has Ash got it?
Yes, Martin Wheatcroft here. Just a very quick question about defence, which seems to be the dog that didn't bite in this budget, and thoughts on whether that will be a big feature of the next budget, given the pressures on defence spending.
Great. And James, we had a question online about the squeeze on spending in this, so maybe you can talk about that too. Yeah, one more.
Richard, apologies, I'm going to come back to your comments at the start just on one specific point. You said the document was disseminated by somebody who'd found it. There was a suggestion yesterday that it may have been emailed or sent in some way, the link to banks. Can you give any clarity on whether that took place or whether it was simply available on the website?
I can't comment on that, I'm afraid.
I'm going to be cheeky and take the question on living wage, James, and then come to you on spending. Is that all right? So on living wage, I think all that's happened at this event is that they've raised the living wage in line with average earnings. So that 4% increase is in line with average earnings. So that's the second lowest that we've seen for some time. So it would be unlikely to me that just keeping our minimum wage up with the pace of average earnings would have a big economic effect. We are much more worried about the effect of youth minimum wages, which are rising at more like 8%. And so I take your point on wage compression, but with the outlook for the labour market and Richard forecasting that 5% unemployment is here to stay until 2027, I think a not enough discussed aspect of our kind of economy at the moment is that high unemployment, the fact that is particularly hitting younger workers, and it doesn't seem to us the right time to align those youth rates with other minimum wage rates. James, we haven't talked much about spending. What's going on?
Yeah, so it's sort of squirreled away in our document, and you should definitely look at all that. But Rachel Reeves holds a lot of store by saying she's not returning to austerity. And if you talk to anyone in a policy department in Whitehall at the moment, you don't quite get the same sort of vibe. So lots of angsting about budgets there. And I suppose if you look in our document and if you look at, towards the end of the forecast period where we don't have that full set of spending plans, what you basically see is if the priorities of this government continue, they spend a lot on health. If they continue to keep up that education spending on per pupil level, and they are serious about increasing defence spending at anything like the rate that Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer seem to be talking about, so heading off to 3.5% of GDP towards the into next Parliament, then other departments are looking like big cuts, potentially something like getting on for 90% of the intensity of cuts during the austerity period. So that's what we're worried about. We've seen a really big prioritisation to frontline services, particularly health, from this government. And the question is, can other departments keep going?
And Richard, there is a bit of a difference of view between the OBR and the Treasury when we just look at the numbers about what the path of spending is going to be and what this event has done to it. Can you explain that a bit for us?
I mean, it comes down to when the Treasury sets departmental spending limits, what level of underspending do you assume against them? In general, when those limits are in place, on average, they get underspent against, but some departments overspend and some departments underspend. And it comes down to a bottom-up view of where you think the pressures match up against the budgets. We thought in this forecast there was a significant number of pressures and an unusually high number relative to the limits themselves, and so for that reason we had a lower underspend number than the Treasury and reflected in our forecast.
So Kamal, just while we wrap up, we're told we won't be here in 6 months' time because we won't have an assessment against the rules. We'll be missing Chapter 7, as Richard says, but we will be here in a year's time. What are both of your predictions for what we might be talking about then?
Well, I think that if the issue is going to be growth, this budget didn't do anything for growth. And I think the most essential thing that Rachel Reeves will be tested on is the UK economy growing at a faster rate than it was when the election took place. And that's going to be the key test. So first of all, will Rachel Reeves be there to deliver next year's budget? I think is likely after her performance yesterday, which I say for the first audience, the Labour audience, that was seen as a Labour budget. And they've got something to take back to the doorsteps. They've got something to sort of talk about and say why this is the government that it is. So I think she's improved her chances of delivering the next budget. And I think it has damaged the prospects for her to be able to come next year and say, We have the economy and the revenues have surprised on the upside, and therefore I am able to announce. I remember speaking, to her team and her people before the election. She would genuinely love to be a chancellor who can stand up in the House of Commons and say, I am delighted to announce tax cuts. And she would be able to do that. And that was what she imagined would be happening over the 5 years of this Parliament. Whether she gets there, I think, is more at risk now than it was when she first had that plan of action over the 5-year period in 2024.
Yale, your predictions?
So my hope is that it will be an earlier budget, so it doesn't run into the Black Friday and the Christmas booking and destroy hospitality sector booking for this period. And also there'll be much less uncertainty because we're not hopefully expecting any tax changes, major tax changing next year. So it's going to be a quiet period, shorter quiet period. And not much there. Maybe a few better messages, a little bit more focus on business and all the other stakeholders that she hasn't really addressed. So giving her a bit more room to do stuff.
Okay, I like that optimism. So I think we should end on support for energy bills coming next year. Tax rise is not until 2028. Go and enjoy Black Friday and help the UK economy. Thank you all very much for joining us today.